It's the week ending Saturday the 6th of May, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen the English local elections presenting Rishi Sunak with his first electoral test, Russia claiming Ukraine targeted a drone attack at the Kremlin, and also on Saturday, the small matter of the coronation of King Charles and Queen Camilla. You can read all you need to know about everything that matters in The Week magazine. We're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team is the boss man, Holden Frith. He's also a hobbyist pilot, a fun fact we will return to later, so park that. From the Week magazine, it's assistant editor Leif Arbuthnot, and we welcome back host of the Spectator's Chinese Whispers podcast, Cindy Yu. And Cindy, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Was this the week that China sends its youth back to the countryside?
So young people say, oh, this is kind of like the long gown is a symbol of a high education, and sometimes it becomes a burden. Like if I didn't attend university, probably I would have lower expectation, and I probably will be satisfied to have a job like a food deliverer or do some or work in the construction site. I don't know, the job that people think are for those who didn't go to university.
Caroline Can, author of Under Red Skies, The Life and Times of a Chinese Millennial, talking on the Spectator's Chinese Whispers podcast to, you.
Good plug.
What's the story, Cindy?
Yeah, so China has record high youth unemployment at the moment. So almost 1 in 5 under 24-year-olds are unemployed. And, there's a pretty big number. And that number actually goes up the more educated you are. So it's actually university graduates are more unemployed. And Caroline Can was telling me about how for her and her peers, lots of these people have been led to believe that education will be their golden ticket out of poverty or just into a different social class. And yet they graduate and they find that there are no jobs left for them, or that it's highly competitive.
So it's not that there's no jobs, it's that there's no jobs that are suitable for people with serious qualifications.
Right. And this is what the Chinese government is very keen to point out, hence sending people down to the countryside. One provincial government has said, there are jobs, you just have to go look for more manual ones or more vocational ones. Look, why don't some of you go down to the countryside and do more farm work and that kind of stuff?
Are they saying it as a question or is it a command? You said sending young people out to the countryside. What is the Chinese government doing?
Well, so this is the Guangdong province's plan, which has been only announced this year. So we don't know exactly how coercive it will be yet, but they have a goal of sending 300,000 graduates to the countryside by 2025. Now, this kind of thing brings back bad memories in China because during the Cultural Revolution, after the first few years of kind of civil war in the cities, the youths who were creating trouble were sent down to countryside by Mao in order to get them out of the cities, basically. And that was a very traumatic experience for a lot of people. So having the government go back to this in at least one province, people online are kind of in outrage about it. So that's why I say it'll depend on the implementation, because it's not clear to me that they can actually bring it back in the way that they have said that they will. So I think we're waiting to see that. But basically, the government is on the back foot looking for ways to solve this youth unemployment problem.
So, Holden, do you think that the plan will be different to what Chairman Mao tried and people were traumatised by? Or do you think actually this is government just showing some hubris or even lack of direction, knowing how to deal with this?
I feel that it has to be different. The Chinese Communist Party has taken some pains really to distance itself from the legacy of Chairman Mao, and particularly for what happened during the Cultural Revolution. There has been some sense that President Xi is in some ways edging towards a rehabilitation, or at least a kind of almost less forgetful approach to Chairman Mao, and is wanting to encourage more of a sense of pride in Chinese history. But even so, under what was called the Up to the Mountains and Down to the Villages movement, which is what Cindy was referring to, there were 17 million people forcibly removed from cities to rural areas, and they're now known in China as a lost generation. So it feels as if, in a country where there has been more of a willingness to protest, anything on that kind of scale and with that sort of compulsion just isn't going to fly.
Although maybe, Leaf, just having a more totalitarian government enables them to be able to think about doing things like this, and it isn't a uniquely Chinese issue. I mean, we have the same thing here in Britain, don't we, where people from rural areas, young people, whether they've got a university degree or not, just don't want to go and work in the fields.
No, they certainly don't. And when there were kind of shortages of workers because of Brexit, there were sort of wistful conversations about how youth unemployment could be transformed because, you know, the strong young could be sent out to the fields to go and pick vegetables and fruit. Those kind of dreams obviously went nowhere because our supposedly pampered young are not keen to do the kind of backbreaking labour that, you know, some people from foreign countries are much more willing to do. I mean, it's true that Chinese youth unemployment is obviously historically pretty high, but the situation in patches of, the rest of the world is not necessarily all that much better. In sort of a lot of African countries, we see lots of, you know, extremely high youth unemployment, you know, things that will edge up to sort of 40%. And in the UK, we have an unemployment rate among youth of about 11%. Germany is really, really low. So they've got lots of kind of clever ways of keeping youth unemployment low. But then Spain and Greece, Italy, historically countries that have had very high youth unemployment. So I think there is a danger with saying, well, you know, the Chinese have got, you know, their economy is doing well, but they're failing their young. But it's really a story that can be said of lots of other countries that are, you know, relatively wealthy.
Yeah, and the thing is, Cindy, it's interesting, isn't it, with China, because people talk about the kind of growth they're seeing with envy here. And yet in China, it's a massive disappointment that it's not growing as quickly as it used to.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, Q1 figures, so in the first 3 months of this year, China's growth was 4.5%. I think Rishi Sunak would kill someone for that kind of growth. And a lot of different Western leaders would as well. But I think it is all about the starting point. The fact that in the beginning of this century, China was looking at 9-10% growth a year. It's very clear that 20 years on, single digit is all it can hope for now. And this has real questions for how powerful China is going to be in the future. You know, if it's only going to be able to sustain 4-5% growth, it will still have a very strong decade. But some people actually think that growth until 2050 will be 2-3% for China, which, you know, on the Chinese scale, given that its income per capita is still only half of that of the American, you know, a lot of Chinese people are still not wealthy enough just to be happy with where they are in life at the moment. And the sheer size of the Chinese GDP, the growth just often comes from how big the country is rather than material wealth that people can feel, at least in the last 5-10 years.
Yeah, and I suppose the government, Holden, are concerned about how the Chinese youth are going to express that disappointment. I mean, obviously, if you disperse them away from the urban centres, they're less likely to challenge the government from there. Must be part of the thinking.
Well, I did see that suggestion that this was effectively attempting to stop graduate students in particular, people with a lot of time on their hands, the sort of age groups who do tend to lead protests, from congregating in sufficient numbers to reach that kind of critical mass. But if that is the plan, I'd say it's not without its own risks, because you are also sending a lot of people with ideas and a willingness to sort of question the established view of the state to places where perhaps those ideas hadn't yet come in contact with people. And so, you know, there is a risk that the Chinese government ends up actually just sort of transmitting a less respectful approach to itself across the country, or even to, you know, those people who go out having been educated, having lived in cities, going into rural areas, actually end up encouraging more people to shift to an urban way of life, and in the long run kind of adding to what it would see as a problem.
Yeah, although I suppose that could be a good thing as well culturally, couldn't it, Leaf? I mean, why not take the politics and experiences of the bigger cities and spread them out to rural areas? That's what Japan was hoping to do. We talked about this on the show earlier this year, incentivizing families with 1 million yen per child to leave Tokyo. That was partly about rejuvenating the rural areas with, you know, a load of hipsters who will start up coffee shops. I mean, they were actually thinking in Japan that would be a good thing.
Yeah.
Do you think that could happen in China too?
No, I'm pretty skeptical that this is a good way of approaching wealth creation. The Cultural Revolution has some pretty stark lessons, which is that city kids, if you dump them in a village, are pretty bad at manual labour. They haven't been brought up to think in the way that rural people have, and it's a really, there was resentment between the sort of people who'd been in the rural areas for a long time and the sort of teenagers who'd been suddenly dropped on them and who were expected to be fed and given things to do. And a lot of these children were very bad at tasks like, hoeing and things like that. So I'm skeptical that, for all that the CCP is much more powerful by comparison with, say, the UK government and Western governments, that they can actually make the magic happen. I think that when you do see people moving out of, say, London to more rural areas, or even just to towns, it's because they kind of want to go. Also, historically, cities and towns have been where major growth comes from. Obviously, we need people to grow our food, but cities are hubs of innovation. And so I think that China, by maybe dabbling in a bit of geographic social engineering, is risking the growth on which the sort of stability of the country is actually dependent.
I mean, there's also the issue, Cindy, I guess, of how do you sell it to their parents? Even if you have a generation who are willing to try this for a few years, sort of see it like a kind of, almost like a military service, this will round my personality, I don't have to stay there forever. Their parents were sold the idea that your next generation will go to university and build a stronger China and they'll work in the tech sector and whatever. They don't want them working back on the farm, do they?
Yeah, I mean, being sent down the countryside will be in the memories of very many of these families. Xi Jinping himself was actually sent down to the countryside and was stuck there for 7 years. So I think some of these parents would be thinking, I don't want the same thing to happen to my child. As I understand it, this Guangdong scheme is saying that they wouldn't be doing as much manual labor as they would be doing trying to revive these local townships and countryside villages by taking their expertise. So that's meant to be kind of white collar jobs. But let's see how it goes. As I say, I mean, it all sounds a bit far-fetched, to be honest. I can't imagine your modern Chinese Generation Z really enjoying any of this or being willing to go.
But what about for their parents? I mean, might it just underline the sense of a failed dream here? We're having to do this thing because it's not working. What we were told isn't happening.
I think the parents are part of the problem, to be honest, the reason we've got to this stage. I say this as someone who has my own tiger mother. I'm hoping she's not listening. But for her and her peers, they did see education as the way out. And they obviously themselves got disrupted by the Cultural Revolution. And so for their kids, they're really, really keen, especially now that they've become parts of the middle class, now that the middle class has expanded in China, really, really keen not to repeat that experience. And what I mean by them being part of the problem is that actually they have been encouraging their children to get higher and higher degree level qualifications. So not just undergraduates, but also masters and PhDs are pretty much the norm now in China, which means that one tobacco factory that I came across a couple of years ago, a third of its new factory line hires had master's degrees. And these are people who are working on the assembly line to roll tobacco. But this is how many graduates are talking about who are not properly working. I do think that the parents' expectations are a massive part of why so many of young people have been pushed into higher and higher education. And for them, it will be interesting to see how much of a political problem this becomes in terms of disillusionment for the young and the old. I think there are quite a lot of different problems that they have to worry about at the moment.
One of the really interesting things about this story, which really came out in your interview, Cindy, with Caroline Can, was just how much of a sense of hierarchy of status there is in the Chinese job market, with people looking down on manual labor. And she was saying that compared with European countries with a welfare state, she felt that over here there's much more of a sense that all jobs have equal status and dignity. I think you can sort of question whether that assessment of European attitude feels entirely accurate from the inside, but even as a perception, it's an amazing shift from a country that's still nominally communist to be looking in our direction with any sense of envy about the status of working class labour. I just thought that was a very striking development.
But also for a country that's still nominally globalist, Leaf, this should be a poacher's charter, shouldn't it? Shouldn't we say, oh, look, there's loads of highly qualified graduates working on factory production lines. Why don't they come and work in the West? That doesn't seem to be happening.
No, I mean, I think that the pandemic has scarred the kind of Chinese economy a little bit still, and that we're still seeing slightly fewer Chinese tourists and people who are wanting to come to the West. There was such an influx of kind of tourists and students and things, and that seems to have peeled off a bit. And also the kind of the atmosphere has become more hostile over the past 10 years to Chinese people in the West. It's much more, before people would say, yeah, they're in Harrods, they're propping up our economy, hooray. But now, you know, in the press, you see stories about Chinese people being embedded in factories and in a sort of nefarious way, or Chinese people creaming off secrets at universities. So I think that the idea that the West can go in and pick the sort of flower of Chinese, kind of the best students that China has going, is not likely. Also, I mean, it's something that's also happened in the UK a little bit, where Tony Blair pushed for a lot of young people to go to university. And obviously, there's been a huge amount of debt that young people have taken on. And in the UK as well, you see people coming out of their undergraduate degrees, sometimes with slightly junky degrees in something that isn't kind of highly valued in the job market. And then they find themselves not really able to get anything other than a job, say, in a restaurant or in a supermarket. I think that something behind the UK youth unemployment figures that are fairly healthy, that worries me, is that a lot of the young are going into jobs that they might not feel really reflects their level of education, just in the way that, you know, it's happening in China as well. So, and that builds up kind of all sorts of problems down the line, I think.
I feel I should explain to the listener that when you said junky degree just then, you were doing air quotes on webcam. I think that'll help you if people know that. All degrees welcome here. Okay, Holden, you're up next after this. Okay, Holden, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Troubled times in the original oil industry.
First, harvested olives enter the mill on a conveyor belt. This process gets rid of about 90% of the leaves, while the remaining 10% of the leaves are ground into paste with olives and pits. Then, the olives are pressed at room temperature using granite wheels, a method that is called cold pressed. It means that oil was extracted with no heat, which will harm its delicate flavor. The paste then moves into a kneading machine that helps break it down into water and oil.
You got to love the variety on this show. How traditional Italian olive oil is made, a video from Insider Food back in 2019. You can watch the whole thing on YouTube. Holden, what's the story?
The story is that a trade body called Coldiretti, which represents Italian farmers, has revealed that a bacteria called Xylella fastidiosa has now killed...
Rather you than me. Xylella, okay.
That's what I'm going for, Xylella fastidiosa. Whatever it's called has now killed 21 million olive trees in southern Italy. This hasn't all happened overnight. The bacteria arrived about 10 years ago and since then has been slowly advancing across Puglia. But the reason this farming group is shouting about it now is that the front line is approaching Bari, which has the highest concentration of olive groves, and they say this is the last chance to stop it.
To stop it doing what? I mean, what's the worst case scenario here?
The worst case scenario is quite bad. It's the bacteria infects the trees and eventually kills them by withering away their leaves effectively, so that they can no longer support themselves. And the only way of stopping it is by taking out the infected trees. So if left unchecked, this could have a really substantial effect. Puglia produces half of all Italian olive oil, and that 21 million tree figure is a third of its total population. Last year, overall Italian olive oil production fell by 30%. So this is having a significant effect on the overall olive oil supplies at a time when other producers are also struggling for various reasons, including climate and drought.
Yeah, and this is a big export for Italy as well, isn't it? Obviously, olive oil.
It is. It's really big at export. It's also, I think, for some of these farmers, at least, it's a way of life as well as a livelihood. You know, some of these trees are more than 1,000 years old. The way of converting olives into oil, as we've just been hearing, is steeped in tradition. And it's not just an economic question, although it is also a very significant economic question.
There have been a lot of theories about this on the internet, Cindy, some of which have been called conspiracy theories. Can you outline some of those? People have been speculating as to what might be causing this bacteria.
Yes, and this is part of the reason why it's taken so long to kind of get on top of the problem almost too late. People thought that it had to do with pesticides or water pollution. These are probably some of the more sane theories, but others said that it was multinationals who wanted to introduce new genetically modified trees by killing off the old trees.
Right.
And locals, it seems like, really believed a lot of these claims spread on social media, and part of the reason why so much action was delayed until it was too late. But I think it seems that people are now starting to realize that actually this is a real bacteria. This is having a real impact. And, just accusing multinationals of doing something isn't going to really solve the problem, which is going to get worse if it reaches other regions.
I mean, it's kind of part of the Italian rural character, that, Leaf, isn't it? To just assume that if something's been done traditionally, then it must be fine. And therefore that there must be some nefarious thing going on if things aren't fine.
Yeah.
But actually, this does appear to be a naturally occurring phenomenon, right?
It does, and it reminds me a little bit of the ash dieback, which is a fungus that has been killing a lot of ash trees in the UK. And my one of them the fungus came to an ash tree in my parents' garden and basically broke my mother's heart. Out of interest, when Holden sent this story, I looked at the price of the 5-litre sort of tank of olive oil that I bought last year, and I bought it in July because I have a sort of scarcity mindset, and I don't like the idea that I could run out of olive oil at any time.
Where does Leaf Arbuthnot buy her big jerry can of olive oil? Is this a farmer's market job, or is it Costco, or what?
No, it's called The Mill, and last July it cost £29 for 5 litres. It's extra virgin olive oil. But if you were to buy it now, it would cost, I think, £41 or £40.
Wow.
So, just that's gone up really quite a lot. And those prices will be also kind of similarly rising in other oils.
Yeah, well, I suppose that really is where it does have effects on all of our lives, doesn't it, Holden? Because whatever your economic bracket and whatever interest you have in oil, whether or not you're ordering, as Leaf does, from a very exciting bespoke producer in large quantities, everyone cooks in oil of some description.
Yeah, and it's an ingredient that's used in a lot of places. It has a knock-on effect, and I think what you're seeing is there's a combination of factors. This disease being one of them, which has led to these price rises. Partly, it's what has had an effect on all food prices, the cost of fuel, fertilizer, electricity, pumping water. But then the areas where most of the world's olives are grown around the southern Mediterranean had very, very hot, dry summer last year. That led to a much lower harvest than expected. And Spain, which is the single largest grower of olives, has had temperatures of 40 degrees this week, which is coming on the end of a long drought. So the expectation is that their harvest is going to be very low this year too, and there'll be more upward pressure on price. This bacteria is actually also present in Spain too, but at the moment it's confined to the very southern part of the country and the Balearic Islands. But clearly there is a risk of further spread there. And so, combined with the pressure of climate, there's a sense that the price pressure on olive oil is only going to go in one direction over the next few years.
So, Cindy, what can be done about this then?
So there's some suggestions, and I am not an olive tree or bacteria expert, but there are some suggestions that you can cut down the infected trees. Obviously, that limits the spread of the infection. But there's also suggestions that if you get rid of the grass around healthy trees, where the insects, so this bacteria is carried by some insects, if you get rid of the grass around healthy trees, you get rid of the places where insects lay their eggs, and so reduce also the possibility that insects are passing these on to healthy trees as well. I guess that is the way to do it. I mean, there's also one final suggestion of planting olive variants that are bacteria resistant. But to be honest, none of this sounds immediately doable. I think regardless, this year's harvest is going to be affected. And it doesn't sound like the Italians are very optimistic that it won't spread to other more high-yielding areas of olive oil in the country. So, yeah, I mean, belated, as I say, because of the social media conspiracy theories.
And I guess, whether or not this has a link to the climate crisis, Leaf, the fact that all that is happening in the environment as well isn't going to make this sort of thing less regular, is it? We're going to see more drought, more diseases in crops.
No, it looks really, really, bad news basically for olive oil. I think the prices are only going to go up over the next few decades as the world's temperature continues to rise. It's just as rains kind of fall less frequently on the Spanish plain or whatever, it means that the olive oil is going to become very expensive. So I don't want to sound extremely negative about it, but it's not a good news story, unfortunately.
Although maybe it means the UK becomes an olive oil producer in some time in the future.
That's true. It could be like how we've become, hot movers in the sparkling wine trade because of the warmer summers that we're getting.
Isle of Wight olive oil just doesn't have the same ring to it, though, does it?
Nope.
Okay. Leaf, you're up next after this. Okay, Leaf, you are finishing the show today. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
The boom of private jets.
Welcome to Air Kim. Usually planes are like dark with lighter leather. Mine, I had custom all light wood.
Kim Kardashian gives a tour of her ultra-luxe private plane. And the Skims founder has us swooning over her one-of-a-kind home in the sky.
I never dreamed I would own a plane. It's just I wanted it to feel like an extension of me and an extension of my home.
Well, swooning's one word for it. Kim Kardashian's ultra luxe plane tour from Entertainment Tonight last year. Okay, so Leaf, if Kim Kardashian's had a private jet for a while, what's the news this week?
So a report has been written, it's called High Flyers, and it's found that the number of private jets has absolutely boomed since 2000, and that last year was basically a kind of one of the record years for private jet flights. One of the findings of it is that there were 5.3 million private flights globally in 2022. And that the report also has very interesting things to say about the low amount of tax that these kind of private flyers are actually paying on all of their flights.
Okay. I mean, in terms of stories that will impact our listeners' lives, I'm sure we have. Yeah. I mean, we were talking about first-class travel last week. I'm sure we have a few listeners that are lucky enough to do that. Probably not that many on private jets right now. So how does this affect me?
Well, it affects you in the sense that you're paying probably more for your flight than you should be because private flyers are not paying their share. And also, the climate change impacts of private flying are significant. Private jets emit at least 10 times more pollutants than commercial planes per passenger. So while maybe our very esteemed listeners are not necessarily going to be going on private jets themselves, there'll be climate change implications. It's also a sort of fashion thing. I think private jets have become much more kind of prevalent in on social media with the rise of TikTok and sort of Instagram, all these rich kids who are bragging about their private jets in a way that I think maybe 20 years ago it was more of the preserve of high flying business people and some celebrities, but it wasn't such a kind of the thing to aim for. Whereas now it probably is.
So what should we do about it in regulatory terms, Cindy? Do you think it's right to try and clamp down on the amount of private jets that are out there? Because you can sort of see a need for, I don't know, politicians and touring rock bands and all the rest of it in a way that actually economically supports people down here on Earth. But then at the same time, it's obviously getting a bit out of hand.
Yeah, sure. I think one good suggestion that this report makes is just to raise taxes, right? I mean, it's still market tweaking. It just means that it becomes more expensive to use your private jet. So this report has a stat from the US which says that taxes on private aviation raise only 2% of the tax revenue for the Federal Aviation Administration, even though private jets account for 17% of the flights handled. So, they're paying disproportionately little for the amount of work they create for traffic controllers. And that's not even to mention the kind of offsetting that they could be required to do. If you either take it out of the tax revenues or levy it on top. Someone like Elon Musk flying 8 minutes for one of his trips last year, he should be made to have to offset some of that. And I think at the moment, because it's such a small group of people that we're talking about, not really affecting everyone's daily lives, it's not really on the front pages, but they should be pulling their weight, as it were. Private jets are disproportionately emitting. And so...
Offset more? What about offset disproportionately more? Kind of like you're indicating. I mean, Elon Musk, you mentioned him. His private jet emitted 132 times as much carbon as the average American does in an entire year. So on that basis, should he be being taxed 132 times more for his flight? It's not just a question of putting it up a bit, is it?
No, exactly. No. I think he should be. I mean, maybe not like for like. Well, I don't know. Maybe you could be. Yeah. I mean, you have to crunch the numbers here. I mean, I don't feel strongly enough that I think rich people shouldn't have nice things. I think they absolutely should. I think people who can afford it. I mean, that's just the market, right? We don't want to be communist like China. And then for someone like Elon Musk, who has to get around the country really quickly, as you mentioned, other politicians as well, I do think that there's a benefit there for them to be able to use private jets still. But yes, I think they should be starting to made to think about their carbon offsetting, because at the moment there is a bit of a no man's land in terms of regulation.
I suppose, is there too much meddling, Holden, just to ask people, is this flight necessary? You know, it's almost like that warning that pops up on an email. Oh, it looks like you've forgotten to put the attachment. Like, you know, do you need to fly 8 minutes today? Should there be a threshold where you have to justify what you're doing?
If you were looking at all of this dispassionately and just trying to reduce emissions as much as you possibly could, then you probably wouldn't start with private aviation, because it's a relatively small percentage of a relatively small percentage of emissions that come from aviation. But it's, tackling climate change isn't just about looking at a spreadsheet and seeing which number is biggest. It's about persuading everyone to change how they live. And that's going to be much harder if you have some people some people actually just spending huge amounts of carbon seemingly willy-nilly in areas where they really don't have to, and not having to pay for the cost.
It's about the fact that there are other options available, right? Elon Musk, if he wanted to, could fly first class from Texas to Miami, and he wouldn't have to do that privately. Whereas, it is a form of transport that for other people doing that flight, a plane is the only sensible way for them to do it.
Yes, and if you are on a scheduled commercial airline traveling long distance, yes, you are responsible for the emission of a significant amount of carbon, but as you say, you have to do that. And the way the modern world works is that we need to travel. We sometimes want to travel, and the cost benefit on that spent carbon feels like it's justifiable in a way that a short flight where there's a perfectly good rail service doesn't. So I think, as Cindy says, you probably can tackle that somehow through the tax system, just to make it prohibitively expensive to use private jets in a kind of reckless way, or just to enforce some sort of restitution so that some of the tax from private aviation goes into carbon offsetting or goes into development of biofuels. Otherwise, there are actually already less damaging fuels available. So you could even have a sort of mandate on the requirement to use low carbon alternatives to regular aviation fuel.
So why is this not happening, Leaf? Rich people can afford to pay more. If they had to pay more, Elon Musk would still be flying his jet. Is it just that, American governments basically don't want to annoy rich people?
I'm not exactly sure why it's not happening. My educated or uneducated guess would be that there's been a lot of pressure on rich sort of politicians in the US who probably fly private jet themselves to keep the status quo as it is. And as Holden says, this is something that doesn't affect actually a huge amount of people. Not few people actually fly private. The proportion of kind of carbon that's being emitted by private jets isn't, it is obviously a drop in the sea in sort of global terms in all the different industries that we're looking at. And so it's not necessarily an item that voters are going to, vote on when it comes to elections. So probably it's in the interests of politicians to not sort of act on this. And the issue will feel very remote to most voters. So I think cynically that those are probably things that are at play.
It's interesting, the sort of influencer thing that you brought up earlier. I mean, Cindy, what do you think that is? The world is getting poorer. People are struggling for things at the moment. Everything's more expensive. And yet there doesn't seem to be the backlash you might expect towards influencers who are showing us glimpses of their very extravagant lives. Why?
No, yeah, it's a good point, Ollie, because I think, thinking about the Chinese context, there is a lot of backlash when people flaunt their wealth. You often see that, especially if it's a politician's family there was a case a couple of years ago where a politician's child was posting a picture online of her luxury shoe collection, and that really created a national backlash in China. But I think in the West, I haven't seen any reactions like that so much. I think maybe it's a sign that people see it more as aspirational. rather than as something to hate. Certainly in the UK, I think a lot of people are aspiring to more wealth rather than seeing it as a problem. If you look at how Labour's attacks on Rishi Sunak and his wealth just haven't really landed, it doesn't really seem like in the UK that's something that people necessarily care about. Somewhat flippantly, I also think the show Succession is making people think about private jets in a much more, aspiring way. No spoilers at all. But they spend probably a third of their time flying around on private jets, making big business deals. And I think just stuff like that, which it seems like it's cool rather than a massive problem. And I think also part of the issue, as Leif and Holden have also said, is just that it's only 4% of the global aviation market. Like, it's just not top of mind for people.
So mostly I agree, we haven't been seeing a backlash against influencers for using private jets because it's cool and it's good entertainment. We saw Karl Lagerfeld, who died a few years ago. His cat Choupette travels around on a private jet, and everyone seems to love that. But there was a backlash against Kylie Jenner, who during the pandemic took a flight that lasted 17 minutes. I think she was with her partner, Travis Scott, flew for a very short amount of time, and everyone got very cross about it on social media. But I think that's more of an exception than the rule, essentially. Most people don't get angry about this stuff. Although with the rise of people tracking private jets, there's certainly more interest in the kind of movements of celebrities. It's a sort of hobby for some people on the internet to see who's flying where.
Now, Holden, I did mention earlier that you were a pilot. I'm going to have to investigate this a little. I'm imagining what you're flying is I imagine you're at the helm of a kind of World War II era two-seater. What is it that you fly, and do you worry about those environmental consequences?
Well, I should say I'm a student pilot, so I'm not yet qualified. I'm having lessons at the moment.
I think we know you're a pilot. You and you bleed Top Gun, Holden.
What I fly is called a Piper PA-28, which is a light aircraft, four-seater. And yeah, I do think about the environmental costs, but actually on those very light aircraft, they're relatively small just because the planes weigh significantly less than most cars do. And they don't go very fast. They don't go that much faster than cars either, although they can cover the ground more quickly because there's no traffic and you go in straight lines. But yeah, in terms of a distance covered, they are pretty similar to the emissions generated by a car. So yeah, it's true to say if I didn't fly it, then there would be less emissions because where I'm flying, there's actually no necessity. It's purely for entertainment. But,
this is the closest we get here on the Week Unwrapped to Entertainment Tonight, showing us around Kim Kardashian's private jet. Holden's insight into his trips from Biggin Hill to Elstree. Well, hopefully this discussion about the environmental consequences of private jets has carbon offset having Rory Reid on the show last week. Here's a hideous. My thanks to Leif, Holden, and to Cindy. You can follow this show for free and get every episode as soon as it's released. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts and tapping follow. You can also get 6 free issues of The Week magazine with a trial subscription if you go to theweek.co.uk/subscribe. In the meantime, I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week.